The spring air hung thick with dread over Rome that March morning, as SS trucks rumbled through streets where civilians dared not look. In the shadow of the ancient city's glory, a different kind of history was being written in blood and vengeance. The partisan attack on a German convoy the previous day had killed 33 soldiers, and now the machinery of Nazi retribution ground forward with mechanical precision. Herbert Kappler, the cold-eyed SS officer who commanded Rome's occupation forces, had received his orders from Berlin. 10 Italian lives for every German fallen. The mathematics of horror had been calculated, the victims already selected from prisons and holding cells. Across the city, 335 men and boys were loaded onto vehicles that morning, told they were being transferred to labor camps. Among them were professors and priests, shopkeepers and students, resistance fighters, and those whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the SS needed to fill their quota. They traveled through Rome's winding streets toward the Via Ardeatina, where ancient caves tunneled into volcanic rock beneath the countryside. The prisoners did not know they were riding toward their execution, though some surely felt the weight of inevitability pressing down like the stone that would soon seal their tomb. Families would wait for days, then weeks, then months for men who would never return home. Inside the Ardeatine caves, the SS had prepared their killing ground with Germanic efficiency. The tunnels stretched deep into darkness, far from the eyes of Rome's citizens and the ears of those who might bear witness. 5 men at a time were forced to kneel in the damp earth, hands bound behind them, while German officers moved methodically down the line with pistols. The caves swallowed their screams and transformed them into echoes that died against stone walls. When the ammunition ran low, they used explosives to finish the wounded, then dynamited the cave entrances to bury the evidence beneath tons of rock and earth. Kappler returned to his headquarters that evening and filed his report with bureaucratic detachment. Another day's work in occupied territory complete. The massacre remained hidden beneath the ground as Rome continued under the boot of occupation, its citizens whispering rumors of disappeared loved ones. But stone and silence cannot hold secrets forever, and the earth remembers what men try to forget. The Ardeatine caves would yield their dead, and justice, though delayed, would come searching for those who filled them with bodies. The summer sun beat mercilessly on Rome's cobblestones when Allied forces finally rolled through its liberated streets that June, tanks rumbling past cheering crowds who threw flowers and wept with relief. But beneath the celebration, a darker current pulled at the city's conscience as whispered stories began emerging from those who had lost fathers and brothers to the Nazi occupation's final months. American officers established temporary headquarters in requisition buildings, processing endless streams of civilians who came forward with testimonies of atrocities committed in the shadows of the Eternal City. Among these accounts, one name repeated with haunting consistency: the Ardeatine caves, where something unspeakable waited beneath tons of rubble and volcanic stone. The smell of death had seeped into the surrounding countryside, faint but unmistakable, leading local residents to avoid the sealed cave entrances that someone had tried so desperately to hide. When Allied engineers finally broke through the collapsed tunnels, the horror that greeted them defied the sanitized language of military reports. Bodies lay stacked in grotesque arrangements where they had fallen, some with hands still bound by wire that had cut into decomposing flesh, others blown apart by explosives that had been used to silence the wounded. The air inside carried the sweet rot of death mixed with cordite and damp earth, a smell that would haunt the soldiers who worked to extract the victims for weeks afterward. Italian officials arrived to begin the impossible task of identification, laying out personal effects on tables in nearby buildings where families came to search for wedding rings, watches, and photographs that might confirm their worst fears. The caves yielded their secrets slowly, each body a testament to the calculated brutality of the massacre. each bound wrist and bullet wound speaking to the methodical nature of the execution. Rome's grief transformed rapidly into fury as the scale of the atrocity became undeniable, newspapers publishing photographs that captured the reality of what occupation had meant for those who disappeared. Crowds gathered at the cave site, now transformed into an impromptu memorial where candles flickered. Beside wilting flowers and handwritten prayers, Allied command received mounting pressure from Italian officials and resistance leaders who demanded swift justice against those responsible, their voices united in a chorus that would not be silenced by bureaucratic delays or jurisdictional complications. The name Herbert Kappler circulated through Rome like a curse, spoken with venom by those who had lost loved ones to his orders. Justice had become more than a legal concept. It was a moral imperative that would drive the machinery of Allied war crimes investigations into motion. The hunt for accountability had begun, and in the corridors of Allied headquarters, files were already being compiled on SS officers who believed they might escape the reckoning. Intelligence units received new mandates to track down perpetrators before they could vanish into the chaos of defeated Germany, their crimes buried beneath the rubble of collapsed regimes. Among those who would take up this mission was a young American operative, still completing her training in the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, unaware that her path would soon intersect with Rome's demand for justice. The dead of the Ardeatine caves waited in their tomb, silent witnesses whose stories would be told through those determined enough to pursue the truth through whatever darkness lay ahead. The telegram arrived at her boarding house on a grey November morning, the paper thin as cigarette tissue and stamped with official seals that promised her life would never return to what it had been. Catherine Morris held it between trembling fingers, while her landlady watched from the doorway with poorly concealed curiosity, the woman's eyes hungry for details that Catherine would never share. The Office of Strategic Services requested her immediate presence in Washington for evaluation and potential recruitment. The dry, bureaucratic language failing to mask the urgency beneath those carefully chosen words. She had applied months earlier on a whim, encouraged by a college professor who believed women could serve their country in ways beyond nursing or factory work, never truly expecting the OSS would see value in a 24-year-old linguistics graduate with neither military experience nor political connections. Yet here was the invitation. Tangible proof that someone in that shadowy organization believed she possessed qualities worth cultivating for intelligence work. She packed that evening, telling her landlady only that government work called, leaving behind the quiet predictability of her translation job for something she couldn't yet name. The OSS training compound existed in deliberate isolation, surrounded by Virginia woodlands that muffled the sounds of weapons fire and shouted commands echoing through morning mist. Catherine arrived with 11 other recruits, a mixed group of academics, journalists, and former military personnel who eyed each other with varying degrees of suspicion and camaraderie. Their instructors were men who had operated behind enemy lines, teaching tradecraft through scenarios that blurred the line between exercise and genuine danger. She learned codes and dead drops, surveillance techniques and counter-surveillance, how to read a room for exits and potential threats within seconds of entering. The physical training pushed her body beyond limits she thought existed, running obstacle courses in darkness while carrying equipment that seemed designed to break her spirit. They taught her to shoot with clinical precision, to pick locks with improvised tools, to lie convincingly under interrogation pressure that left her shaking and nauseated. The counterintelligence modules fascinated her most, the intricate dance of information gathering where patience mattered. More than courage and observation outweighed action. Instructors emphasized that intelligence work was 90% tedious documentation and only 10% the dramatic moments that justified all the waiting. She excelled at pattern recognition, spotting inconsistencies in fabricated stories during training scenarios that her male counterparts missed. Her language skills became her greatest asset, fluency in Italian and passable German, marking her for potential European assignment. The war was ending, instructors reminded them constantly, but the work of securing peace and accountability had barely begun. Nazi officials were already fleeing justice, disappearing into networks that Allied intelligence needed to infiltrate and dismantle. Her orders came through in early spring. Assignment to the War Crimes Investigation Unit based in occupied Germany, with immediate deployment to Italy for preliminary interviews. Catherine accepted the manila folder containing her mission brief, understanding finally why they had trained her in interrogation techniques and document analysis rather than sabotage or partisan coordination. The dead of the Ardeatine caves needed someone who could build airtight cases against their killers, someone who understood that justice required meticulous evidence gathered from witnesses still traumatized by occupation. She boarded the military transport bound for Europe, carrying nothing but essential gear and the weight of expectation, knowing that somewhere in the chaos ahead, Herbert Kapler's trail waited to be followed. The hunt was no longer abstract. It had become her mission, her purpose, her responsibility to those silenced voices demanding their stories be heard. The train, carrying Catherine across the shattered spine of Europe, moved through landscapes that seemed apocalyptic in their devastation, whole cities reduced to skeletal ruins, where survivors picked through rubble like ghosts, searching for memories of their former lives. She pressed her face against the grimy window as they passed through what had been Munich, witnessing the scope of destruction that made her training compound seem like a child's playground in comparison. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist, replaced by mountains of broken masonry and twisted steel that stretched toward horizons thick with dust and the acrid smell of fires still burning weeks after surrender. Displaced, persons crowded makeshift camps beside the railway, their hollow eyes tracking the military transport with expressions beyond despair or hope, suspended in some liminal state between survival and truly living. The war had ended, but its aftermath sprawled across the continent like an open wound, and Catherine understood for the first time that her mission existed within chaos that defied imagination. This was the terrain where war criminals would attempt to vanish, melting into the desperate masses or fleeing through networks that thrived in administrative collapse. Her briefing officer in Frankfurt occupied a requisition department overlooking the cratered remains of what guidebooks had once called a beautiful medieval square, now home to a processing center for refugees and captured enemy personnel. Major Hastings spread reconnaissance photographs across a desk scarred by cigarette burns, each image documenting the systematic dismantling of Nazi command structures as officers abandoned uniforms and assumed false identities. The rat lines were already operational, he explained, routes running south through Austria into Italy, where sympathetic clergy and fascist remnants helped fugitives reach ports offering passage to Argentina or Syria. Intelligence indicated that dozens of high-value targets had already slipped through Allied fingers, disappearing into the chaos before proper tribunals could be established. Catherine studied photographs of men in civilian clothes, their faces bearing the careful blankness of those attempting to become invisible, understanding that Kapler could be anywhere in this landscape of dissolution. The Major lit another cigarette and told her that witnesses were difficult to locate, traumatized populations reluctant to trust occupying forces even when those forces promised justice rather than retribution. The tribunal headquarters in Nuremberg represented an attempt to impose order on moral chaos, a massive undertaking that required armies of translators, investigators, and legal experts to process evidence of atrocities that seemed to multiply with each passing day. Catherine walked through halls where captured documents filled entire rooms, testimony transcripts stacked in towers that threatened to collapse under their own weight. Each page another fragment of systematic horror that demanded documentation and accountability. The scale overwhelmed her initially, this bureaucratic machinery of justice grinding forward, while perpetrators continued fleeing through gaps in Allied occupation zones. She attended preliminary hearings where defendants sat behind glass, their ordinariness more disturbing than any theatrical evil, realizing that monsters often wore unremarkable faces and spoke in measured tones about orders followed and duties performed. The prosecution teams worked with grim determination, building cases that required irrefutable evidence chains connecting commands to executions, orders to implementations, policy to individual acts of murder. Her assignment became clear in those chaotic weeks as she absorbed the landscape of post-war investigation work, understanding that finding Kappler meant operating in a Germany where records had been destroyed, witnesses scattered, and entire populations were lying about their pasts. She would need to return to where the crime occurred, to Rome where the massacre began, following the trail backward through testimony and evidence until the path forward revealed itself. The hunt would be conducted in rubble and refugee camps, through forged papers and false names, against time and the determined efforts of those who wanted certain crimes forgotten. Catherine packed her field kit with renewed purpose, knowing that justice for 335 dead civilians depended on investigators willing to pursue truth through the wreckage of a shattered continent. Rome, in autumn, wore its liberation like an ill-fitting coat, the city caught between grateful celebration and the haunted knowledge of what had occurred in darkness beneath German occupation. Catherine arrived as Allied administrators were still establishing governance, moving through streets where propaganda posters peeled from ancient walls and citizens navigated the delicate politics of claiming resistance credentials while obscuring collaboration. She checked into a requisitioned hotel near the Via Veneto, her credentials identifying her as a documentation specialist with the Allied Commission, a cover that allowed access to archives and witnesses without announcing her true purpose. The Ardeatine caves lay beyond the city's southern edges, a wound in the landscape that locals approached with religious reverence and barely contained rage. She visited on her second day, descending into limestone galleries where the massacre had unfolded. The walls, still bearing marks that made her stomach tighten with horror, she refused to show. The witnesses came slowly, cautiously, each interview requiring patience and careful handling of trauma that remained raw months after liberation. An elderly woman who lived near the caves described hearing trucks arriving in darkness, then explosions that sealed the galleries, her hands trembling as she spoke of smoke drifting through her windows, carrying smells she couldn't identify but would never forget. A partisan who survived the initial attack that triggered the reprisal sat in Catherine's borrowed office and recounted the mathematics of Nazi vengeance. 33 Italians selected for death for each German soldier killed, the precision of cruelty that characterized occupation policy. She filled notebooks with testimony, cross-referencing accounts to build a timeline of orders issued from headquarters on Via Tasso, the torture center, where political prisoners had been interrogated before selection for execution. Each conversation added detail to her understanding of how Kappler had operated, the careful documentation he maintained even while committing murder. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a junior officer in the Italian police force who had been forced to assist with transporting prisoners to the execution site. He appeared at her hotel, unannounced, nervous and chain-smoking, explaining that he had witnessed Kappler personally supervising the selections, checking names against lists with bureaucratic precision. The officer described how the commandant had remained at the caves throughout the killings, ensuring proper execution of his orders, then departed in an official vehicle. As engineers prepared the explosive charges that would seal the galleries, Catherine leaned forward, sensing the importance of his next words, watching his face work through shame and desperate need for absolution. He provided details about Kapler's staff, names of subordinates who might know the commandant's current whereabouts, and mentioned rumors that high-ranking officers had maintained contacts in northern territories even after official surrender. She spent weeks following the threads he provided, interviewing former German personnel held in Allied detention facilities, building a network of information that slowly revealed patterns in how occupation leadership had planned for potential defeat. Kapler had not been a man who believed in romantic last stands or theatrical exits, but rather someone who understood survival required preparation and maintained connections. Catherine charted relationships between officers, tracked family connections in Bavaria and Austria, and gradually assembled a profile of a war criminal who believed himself too valuable or too careful to face justice for crimes committed under authority he considered legitimate. The trail led Catherine north through a Germany that existed more as concept than nation. Cities reduced to skeletal ruins where survivors picked through rubble, searching for anything salvageable while winter approached. With the promise of hunger and cold, she traveled in military vehicles requisitioned through intelligence channels, her documentation allowing passage through checkpoints where displaced persons gathered in desperate thousands, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of those who had survived horror only to face uncertain futures. Munich appeared through grey November rain, its famous architecture transformed into jagged walls and collapsed roofs where resistance had made final stands against advancing American forces. She established temporary headquarters in a commandeered apartment building where electricity functioned sporadically and heating remained theoretical, sharing cramped offices with British counterintelligence officers tracking different fugitives through the same networks of sympathizers and enablers. The rat lines operated with surprising organization despite occupation authorities' efforts at disruption. Networks of former SS officers and Nazi party officials moving escapees toward ports in Genoa and Spanish border crossings that led to sanctuary in Argentina and Syria. Catherine infiltrated their edges carefully, posing as an Austrian widow searching for her brother who had served in Italy, a cover story that required maintaining perfect German dialect while projecting desperate vulnerability rather than investigative competence. She met contacts in gutted churches and basement taverns where black market cigarettes purchased information, each conversation a careful dance of revealing enough need to seem legitimate while concealing her true purpose. One former Wehrmacht sergeant, bitter about abandonment by officers who escaped while enlisted men faced prisoner camps, described the escape routes with vengeful precision, sketching maps on borrowed paper that showed safe houses maintained by Catholic organizations and business owners who still believed in the cause. The false leads consumed weeks of dangerous work, following whispers that Kapler had been seen boarding ships in Mediterranean ports or crossing into Switzerland. With forged documentation identifying him as a merchant, Catherine tracked each rumor through its origins, interviewing dock workers and border guards, gradually learning to distinguish genuine intelligence from opportunistic fabrication by desperate people willing to trade invented information for cigarettes or occupation currency. A particularly promising lead took her to the Austrian border where local police reported a suspect matching Kapler's description, but the investigation revealed only a minor functionary attempting to reach family in Bavaria. His papers genuine enough to authorize release, despite Catherine's frustration at another dead end consuming precious time. She returned to Rome in early December, carrying the weight of failed leads and growing concern that Kapler had successfully escaped, that the networks she penetrated represented deliberate misdirection, while the actual target traveled comfortably towards South American anonymity. The city's winter light held a quality that made ancient stones glow amber in late afternoon. beauty that felt obscene against the memory of testimony she carried, voices of witnesses describing methodical murder in limestone darkness beneath this same sun. The breakthrough arrived not through dramatic confrontation, but through bureaucratic patience, a detail noticed in Italian police reports that suggested patterns rather than revelations. Catherine sat in a borrowed office at Allied headquarters, reviewing arrest records from the immediate aftermath of Rome's liberation, searching for anomalies in the chaos of those first weeks when German forces retreated north and collaborators disappeared into civilian populations. A notation caught her attention, barely visible, in hurried handwriting, describing a German officer detained briefly near Lake Como before being released due to documentation confusion during the jurisdictional transfer between Allied units. The date aligned with Kapler's last confirmed sighting in Rome, the location suggesting northward movement that had stopped rather than continued toward established escape routes. She requested additional files from Italian authorities, cross-referencing detention records with witness statements from northern regions where German command structures had maintained presence during the final retreat, building a picture of someone who had not fled the country but merely relocated within it. British intelligence confirmed her suspicions through their own surveillance networks, monitoring fascist sympathizers in industrial cities where Mussolini's Republic of Salo had maintained its ghostly authority during the final war years. A signals officer named Patterson spread intercepted correspondence across the conference table, letters between former collaborators that mentioned a German advisor providing consultation on avoiding prosecution, language carefully vague but suggestive of ongoing presence rather than distant memory. Catherine studied the postmarks and return addresses, mapping connections between writers who formed a constellation around Milan and surrounding towns where black-shirt militias had recruited most heavily. The pattern suggested protection networks still functioning despite official dissolution, businessmen and clergy maintaining loyalty to disappeared authorities through practical assistance that kept fugitives hidden in plain sight among populations that remembered collaboration more fondly than Allied authorities preferred acknowledging. The coordination required delicate diplomacy between American intelligence priorities and Italian sovereignty concerns. Prosecutors, eager for arrests, balanced against politicians nervous about exposing continued fascist sympathy among constituents. Catherine met with investigating magistrates in Milan, offices where Mussolini's portrait squares remained visible on walls beneath hastily hung photographs of the new government, discussing evidence standards and arrest procedures while carefully not mentioning the networks that made Kapler's survival possible. A young prosecutor named Rossi proved more interested in justice than political calculation, his brother having died in the Ardeatine caves, giving him motivation that transcended bureaucratic caution. Together, they reviewed intelligence summaries and witness statements, building legal frameworks around intelligence work that would justify surveillance operations in regions where local authorities might prove deliberately unhelpful. The location narrowed through patient observation rather than dramatic raids, surveillance teams watching suspected safe houses and tracking movement patterns among known sympathizers, until a figure emerged whose routines suggested military discipline barely concealed beneath civilian performance. Catherine watched from borrowed apartments through field glasses as the target maintained schedules too precise for ordinary life, movements that revealed training in counter-surveillance through their very attempts at appearing unremarkable. The confirmation came through photographic comparison. Images captured during market visits matched against SS personnel files until identity became certainty. The monster reduced to a middle-aged man buying vegetables while justice prepared its accounting. The surveillance operation required choreography more delicate than any combat mission Catherine had executed during active warfare. Every movement calculated to observe without alarming, to gather evidence while preventing escape. The apartment overlooking the target's residence smelled of mildew and old coffee, its windows offering clear sightlines to the modest building where Kapler maintained his careful existence among neighbors who asked no questions about the quiet German who kept irregular hours. Catherine rotated watch schedules with British intelligence officers and carefully vetted Italian police investigators, maintaining 24-hour observation that documented routines, visitors, and potential vulnerabilities in the security the former SS commander believed protected him. Rossi joined them on the third evening, studying their subject through binoculars with the intensity of someone seeking justice for personal ghosts. His hands steady, despite the emotion Catherine recognized in his careful silence. They photographed every entrance and exit, mapped surrounding streets that might facilitate escape, and identified sympathizers among local residents whose warning might give their target precious minutes to disappear again into networks that had sheltered him successfully for months. The planning sessions stretched through late nights in Allied headquarters, military precision applied to civilian arrest that required coordination between multiple jurisdictions and competing authorities. British officers wanted dramatic capture that demonstrated Allied determination. American command preferred quiet efficiency that avoided embarrassing Italy's fragile post-war government, while Italian prosecutors demanded procedures that would withstand legal challenges from defense attorneys already preparing obstruction strategies. Catherine navigated these competing interests with diplomatic patience, learned through intelligence work, building consensus around operational plans that satisfied security requirements while respecting sovereignty, concerns that made international cooperation possible. They rehearsed approach routes and contingency scenarios, prepared equipment and backup units, coordinated timing with local authorities whose cooperation remained uncertain until the final moment. The maps covering the conference table showed a small northern town transformed into tactical problem, each street and building representing potential complications in an operation where failure meant losing their target forever into rat lines that had already successfully evacuated thousands. The safe house they identified as Kapler's primary refuge occupied a residential street where fascist officials had once maintained comfortable distances from working-class neighborhoods, its genteel appearance masking the calculation behind its selection. Surveillance revealed a landlord with known black shirt affiliations, neighbors whose silence suggested either fear or sympathy, and a rear entrance opening onto gardens that connected to parallel streets, offering escape routes through residential blocks where pursuit would prove difficult. Catherine watched the building's rhythms through changing light, morning routines and evening patterns that revealed a man living with constant awareness of potential, discovery, movements that never fully relaxed into civilian normalcy. She noted the absence of visitors who might complicate arrest scenarios, the solitary existence suggesting someone whose former comrades had abandoned him to individual survival rather than collective protection. The isolation would simplify tactical execution while somehow making the operation more melancholy. This careful stalking of a monster reduced to lonely routine in borrowed rooms, far from the power he had once wielded with such terrible efficiency. The arrest date arrived with autumn rain, turning cobblestones slick and grey, weather that matched the somber purpose of justice finally catching up to atrocity. Nearly 18 months after the massacre that had stained Rome's ancient stone with innocent blood, Catherine positioned herself with the arrest team in pre-dawn darkness, watching the building where Kapler slept, unaware that his careful disappearance had finally failed. That patient investigation had unraveled the threads of protection woven by sympathizers whose loyalty could not ultimately defeat determined accountability. The operational commander checked his watch in the dim light, coordinating with units covering potential escape routes, waiting for the precise moment when surprise would overwhelm any resistance the former SS officer might attempt. Catherine felt the familiar Pre-operation tension that never quite became comfortable regardless of experience, knowing that months of careful work would succeed or fail in the next handful of minutes, that justice for 335 murdered civilians depended on execution flawless enough to prevent the escape that had eluded them for so long. The door splintered, inward under the controlled force of the breaching team, wood fragmenting in the grey morning light as Allied soldiers flooded through the entrance, with weapons raised and commands shouting through the modest apartment where Herbert Kappler had believed himself safely hidden. Catherine followed the initial assault team into rooms that smelled of stale cigarettes and nervous sweat, her service pistol steady as they swept through the small space toward the bedroom where their target scrambled from sleep into the nightmare of discovery. He stood in rumpled civilian clothes that could not disguise the military bearing still evident in his posture, hands rising slowly as British soldiers surrounded him with rifles trained on his center mass, the former SS commander's face cycling through shock and calculation before settling into cold resignation. Catherine watched his eyes scanning for escape routes that did not exist, measuring distances he could not possibly cross, the predatory intelligence that had orchestrated Massacre now, trapped by walls closing with inexorable finality. The arrest happened with surprising quiet. After the initial violence of entry, professional soldiers securing a dangerous prisoner with efficiency born from years of combat experience, metal handcuffs clicking shut around wrists that had signed execution orders for hundreds. The search of his quarters revealed documents hidden beneath floorboards, false identification papers bearing names he had prepared for further flight, and photographs that would later prove crucial in establishing his identity beyond legal doubt. Catherine supervised the evidence collection with meticulous attention, knowing that defense attorneys would challenge every detail of procedure, that justice for the victims required documentation perfect enough to withstand scrutiny from judges weighing international law still being written in the aftermath of unprecedented atrocity. She found letters from family members who had maintained contact despite his fugitive status, correspondence that mapped networks of support stretching across borders that had sheltered war criminals with disturbing effectiveness. Kappler watched this systematic dismantling of his hiding place with expression carefully neutral, the mask of bureaucratic detachment that had allowed him to treat murder as administrative problem now reasserted as final defense against the accountability closing around him. The British commander read formal charges in precise English that Italian translators converted into words Kappler understood perfectly, his fluency in the language of his victims making translation almost unnecessary formality. They transported him through streets awakening to autumn morning, civilians pausing to watch the Allied convoy moving with purpose toward military headquarters, where holding cells waited for prisoners whose crimes exceeded ordinary criminal categories. Catherine rode in the escort vehicle, watching Kappler's profile through the reinforced cage that separated captive from captors, studying the face of someone who had transformed retaliation into massacre without apparent conscience, troubling the orders he had executed with administrative thoroughness. He maintained silence during the journey, despite attempts at conversation from British intelligence officers hoping for early cooperation, his military discipline still functioning even as the structures that had legitimized his authority crumbled into historical infamy. The vehicle passed buildings still bearing scars from occupation and liberation, physical evidence of the conflict that had consumed Europe, while Kappler had administered terror from Roman headquarters, with paperwork that documented atrocity in careful detail. Catherine felt no triumph in his capture, only weary satisfaction that months of patient investigation had prevented another escape into impunity that would have mocked the memories of those murdered in caves that had become tomb and memorial simultaneously. The interrogation room at Allied headquarters offered stark contrast to the comfortable apartment where Kappler had maintained his delusional refuge, metal table and harsh lighting designed to strip away the protections that civilian life had temporarily provided. The courtroom assembled in Rome carried weight beyond its physical dimensions, stone walls bearing witness as prosecutors presented evidence against Herbert Kappler with methodical precision that transformed horror into documented fact admissible under international law, still being codified through trials defining justice for unprecedented crimes. Catherine sat among the observers watching testimony unfold from survivors who described the deception that had led their loved ones into caves that became execution sites, voices breaking as they recounted, discovering bodies months later in mass graves that had shocked even hardened soldiers accustomed to war's brutality. The defendant maintained his military posture throughout proceedings that stretched across weeks of testimony, his defense arguing superior orders and wartime necessity, with arguments that judges rejected as insufficient. Justification for massacre that had exceeded even the brutal retaliation he claimed as authorization. Documents Catherine had helped secure formed the prosecution's foundation, Kappler's own signatures on execution orders proving his direct responsibility for deaths that had traumatized Rome and symbolized occupation's cruelty in its most concentrated form. The verdict arrived with judicial gravity, befitting crimes that had demanded creation of new legal frameworks to address atrocities beyond traditional warfare's boundaries. Life imprisonment pronounced as sentence for someone who had treated human life as administrative problem requiring permanent solution. Catherine watched. Kappler's removal from the courtroom, feeling neither satisfaction nor closure, only recognition that legal accountability represented necessary but insufficient response to suffering that could never be adequately addressed through criminal proceedings. The families of the 335 victims received formal justice through verdict and sentence, yet their loss remained absolute, regardless of courtroom outcomes that could not restore what had been destroyed in caves that would forever mark Rome's historical memory. She thought of the other operatives still pursuing war criminals through Europe's chaos, knowing that many perpetrators would escape into new identities while others would face tribunals that attempted to measure unmeasurable harm through legal instruments designed for different categories of wrongdoing. The work had revealed how efficiently bureaucratic systems could facilitate mass murder when moral constraints were removed from administrative processes that treated killing as logistical challenge, requiring systematic solution. The OSS had contributed crucial intelligence to proceedings that established precedents for international justice, operatives like Catherine, providing evidence that transformed witness testimony into legally sustainable cases against defendants whose crimes had been thoroughly documented by regimes obsessed with record-keeping even for their most heinous actions. Years later, reflecting on the investigation that had consumed months of dangerous work through post-war Europe's landscape, Catherine understood her role as small part of larger accounting that remained perpetually incomplete. The Ardeatine massacre had entered history as one among countless atrocities committed during conflict that had shattered previous assumptions about civilization's constraints on organized violence and systematic murder. Kappler would eventually escape from prison decades later through circumstances that mocked the justice his trial had supposedly secured, dying free while his victims remained forever in caves that had become sacred memorial to occupation's cruelty. The 335 names inscribed at the massacre site represented individual lives with stories that had ended in darkness, murdered not for actions, but for existence in wrong place during wrong historical moment. Catherine's contribution to ensuring accountability had mattered, despite limitations of justice systems struggling to address crimes without precedent in legal tradition. Her work part of collective effort to establish that even victorious powers could not simply ignore atrocities committed during warfare's chaos. The legacy of OSS operatives who had pursued war criminals would extend beyond specific cases into frameworks of international law that acknowledged individual responsibility, even within military hierarchies that had previously shielded perpetrators behind claims of following orders from superiors. The photographs of victims displayed during trial proceedings remained burned into Catherine's memory, alongside image of Kapler's expressionless face during testimony describing murders he had orchestrated with bureaucratic efficiency. The contrast between human suffering and administrative detachment, revealing how easily systematic killing could be normalized within institutional structures that prioritized obedience over moral judgment. She had helped ensure that at least this one perpetrator faced legal accountability for actions that had traumatized city and symbolized occupation's brutality in its most concentrated horror, contributing to historical record that would document crimes even as perpetrators attempted to escape into anonymity that post-war chaos had facilitated for those who successfully disappeared. The work had demanded everything she possessed of skill and determination, operating in dangerous environments where remaining Nazi networks protected fleeing criminals, while Allied authorities struggled to establish order sufficient for judicial processes requiring evidence standards higher than military necessity had previously demanded. Justice for the Argentine victims remained imperfect but real, achieved through combined efforts of survivors who testified despite trauma, investigators who pursued evidence through difficult circumstances, and legal professionals who constructed cases under unprecedented conditions against defendants whose crimes had required invention of new judicial frameworks to address. What price can truly be paid for 335 innocent lives taken in darkness? Subscribe to witness more untold stories from the shadows of history.